I'm Plastic Swans, and outside of YouTube, I actually work in the construction industry, so I know a little bit about what goes into the design of healthcare buildings like hospitals, clinics, surgeries. Today I'm going to see how accurately I can develop a hospital in Project Hospital compared to how an actual hospital would be built in real life. Unlike some of the other hospital sims, Project Hospital has marketed itself specifically as a serious simulation. I'm going to see how close I can get to the real thing. Right, so they really throw you in at the deep end, don't they? Car park and an ambulance drop-off. Not a great car park either. Gonna have to do something about that first. So I've extended these car parking spaces out to make a car park that's close to the emergency room. Real hospitals tend to have these types of car parks close to the emergency room, and it's for people that have decided to drive themselves rather than get an ambulance to emergency care. Usually a hefty fee though, that's why there's not many of the spaces. Other cheaper parking is normally a little bit further away, so maybe over the road here, and that would be a big multi-storey car park that could accommodate a lot more people and say visitors and also the staff parking as well. What's important here is making sure I segregate that pedestrian route from the ambulance's blue light route. You want to make sure that ambulance drop-off point is as clear as possible at all times. And it's our first problem. Game won't let me put an ambulance here. They're only allowed in those first 6 spaces at the start of the game. That's going to be a problem. I need to rethink this layout. Right, so I started a new map in the end as the other layout, where it was forcing ambulances to park so far away from where the patients will be dropped off in an ambulance. That's just not realistic, particularly with the 2 pedestrian crossings right next to it. In an ideal world, I want these ambulances parked right up next to that drop-off point, but the game has other ideas, so let's just work with what we got. There's a short road linking the ambulance drop-off point to the parking bays here now. This is more feasible than what we had before. Now I'm going to move on to the ER and the emergency care setup. So building a hospital from scratch is pretty complex in real life. There's a lot of regulations and design guidance involved. This ensures a healthcare building is appropriate for the clinicians to do their job effectively, whilst also protecting patients and promoting a healing environment. This will shape how our hospital develops beyond what the game wants you to do. So, taking consideration of things like privacy and dignity, infection prevention and control, security, logistics, and the clinical pathways. What I'm building up here first is the emergency department. This needs to be right next to the ambulance drop-off, and next to that we need to have the trauma centre. This way the ambulance drop-off is servicing both people who arrive with something like a broken leg that can be treated via the ED, and for those whose ailments are a bit more serious, like maybe a car crash or something, they'll be heading straight to the trauma centre. Okay, so reception is building up nicely. You'll notice here there's a couple of details I've added. The entrance is serviced by 2 doors from the pedestrian access, and there's also a restricted access door that leads through to the ambulance drop-off. I've deliberately set it up this way so you don't have people wandering around the ambulance entrance unless they absolutely need to be there. That corridor from the ambulance drop-off will only lead to hospital areas, so no patient should be using it unless they've been admitted via ambulance and need hospitalisation straight away. Limiting access here helps with infection prevention and control, so you might have patients with hefty injuries being transferred to the trauma centre here, maybe lots of blood or whatnot. You don't want people traipsing through that area for that reason. Also, restricting access is preserving the dignity of patients coming through in those states. That's why there's no windows facing the ambulance drop-off too. Something else I've set up here. You'll notice that the reception desk has no access from the public-facing side. This is standard practice in hospitals for safety reasons. Unfortunately, violence is something healthcare professionals have to deal with in the workplace. When people are poorly, sometimes they're not themselves and they can lash out at those that are actually trying to help them, particularly if there's a long waiting time at the ED. Our emergency departments are also dealing with a lot of intoxicated people who aren't thinking clearly. So that physical barrier there, that's absolutely necessary and very realistic. You'll notice the reception desk also has a direct line of sight to those entering and exiting the building. There's no windy corridors where something the staff can't see could possibly happen. Now, here I'm adding the doctor's offices where patients will first get seen. I made this room into a prefab and copy-pasted it for the whole section. One thing I really applaud the game for here is the prefabrication options it provides for repeatable rooms. I think this was probably added to the game more for speeding up gameplay, but the developers have actually got this exactly right for real hospital construction. Real life hospital development is absolutely going for prefabricated and repeatable rooms, and there's a reason for that. Clinicians aren't really assigned one office they work in, and that's the only room they'll work in at any given time. They provide care across multiple rooms depending on what they're doing, what department they're in, who they're treating, who's on duty. To treat a patient effectively, it's absolutely essential clinicians know exactly where everything is that they need to treat a patient. So where supplies are kept, where medical equipment is stored, it's critical. Repeatable rooms, boring as it may seem for gameplay here, it guarantees that everything's in the same place, and that's very true to real life. So thumbs up for me on that point. You'll notice here too, I've segregated the doctor's offices from the main reception. That again is for contamination control and promoting a healing environment. Now, I know in-game patients miraculously show up at the hospital, whatever state they're in, on their own. But in real life, a hospital's ED's main reception will at most points be a bit chaotic. A lot of people bustling about, maybe friends and family have come in with the patient. The doctor's office will be restricted to only those seeking treatment, making it a quiet space, limiting the risk of contamination and putting the patient at ease. The corridor I'm building up next to this, that's where I'll be linking up the other non-urgent departments for the next stages of care, so like radiology, the hospital laboratories and whatnot. Like a real hospital, I'm trying to limit where patients can go and ease the flow of people through these areas and the clinical pathways in a logical way. Another idea I've been putting through here to reflect a real hospital is, well, the game gives us a lot of these nice little decorative items such as the plants and some other things. And even though it looks lovely, those sort of things, they try and limit that in hospitals because obviously you have to clean it. And, you know, when especially an ED department where people are really sick. The same goes with some of the floor and wall finishes. So, for example, tile. Now, tile isn't being used that often anymore because obviously it's a lot more difficult to clean tile than it is to clean something that has a smooth surface. And the same goes, you'll notice in hospitals that the corners around the wall and the floor, they kind of curve so it doesn't have a right angle where dirt and grime could build up. So you'll notice in the build here that the colour palette I've used is pretty dull, but it's because I've tried to keep it to materials that would actually be used in a hospital. And I did notice that they had even like wall panelling, like a wood panelling. Absolutely would not be used in a hospital these days. Not on the inside anyway. I think I have put it here like on the outside of the building because I'm trying to see if I can mimic the environmental paneling that they use sometimes. So they will use natural wood on the outside of a building. I don't know if it's coming across that way though, so maybe I'll change that. Now this section I'm building here, this is kind of the back of house area, so it's got the cleaning cupboard in it and the staff room for the department. This has been segregated by those little restricted doors again, because you do want to try and keep your patient areas, your staff areas and your public areas as segregated as you can. I'm building this up in a way that most staff areas are going to be in the centre of the hospital, and they will have their own corridors that take them around the building where possible. As this build develops, what I want to see happening is that you have like a public area where patients can access freely, and then you have the hospitalised areas where, so for example, where patients are transported on stretchers from department to department, that's like separated. Think of it in a way like, so imagine that you were in hospital for a fracture or something and you had to go to get an x-ray. You wouldn't see someone in a stretcher being rushed down to intensive care. Hospitals plan these routes carefully to avoid that, so that's what I'm trying to do with this build too. Alright, moving on to the trauma centre. I went through a couple of iterations of the design for this section of the hospital. The main focus of this section was to build something that has really quick access to the ambulance bays. It also has a corridor on the other side that links it to public access, but to be honest, you're not going to be getting a lot of the public going in there. I've also focused here on the nurses station and the doctor's on-call room. I think the game wants you to have these like separate and across a corridor or something, but in a real hospital you are going to have nurses stations inside the trauma centre, so I've built that in. I've made sure that the nurses stations have full sight of all the beds that they've been in charge of. This is something that clinicians always ask for because it's much easier for them to do their job if they can see the patients at all times. Alrighty, so this is where I'm up to so far. We've got the ED in, so we've got the doctor's offices, reception, all the staff buildings, and the trauma unit. Never quite got back to putting that other car park in. I'll have to see where I can squeeze that in now. I'm happy with how everything's going, and I think it is looking quite realistic. The ED's almost complete, we just need to add the observation ward. Now, I've left this out specifically at the moment because I think I'm going to put that on the next story. I'm okay having clinics on the ground floor, but when you start getting into the wards, now they're normally put on higher floors because you have to think of the patient's comfort. There's a whole thing about promoting a healing environment, and part of that is making sure there's like adequate temperature, adequate light, natural light, and as little noise as possible. Also privacy. Privacy gets easier when you're on a higher floor because obviously the windows aren't looking directly out onto a ground floor level. So observation ward, I'm holding off building until I start building the second level. Join me next time when I'm going to start building the second level of care, which is the other clinics that will be on the ground floor. And I can't wait to start linking up all these departments in super effective ways. Until then, I hope you found this interesting. Let me know in the comments if this is something that you want to see more of. So thank you for watching. Bye for now.